The stars above Ultramar dimmed to embers, a carrion light that turned every polished hull into a reliquary left in a fire. In the void between worlds, dead convoys drifted like reefs, their bones of steel luring scavengers that never came. Macragge turned beneath cloud-buried auroras, the polar caps wound in winds that smelled of iron and snow. Orbital weapons that had slept for centuries woke to liturgy and diagnostic, their machine spirits coaxed from silence by incense and careful hands. Beneath the mountain, a Primarch's marble face regarded the storms without blinking, the shrine lamps shivering as if afraid of their own small flames. Across the beacons of the eastern fringe, rumour moved faster than ships, a hunger with 1,000 faces, a tide that learned as it ate. We truly love and care for you. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Marneus Calgar read the void, like a penitent reads the margins of scripture, tracking faint distortions in dust and gravitic wake, the way a hunter reads bent grass. The tactical hololith threw cold light across his features, carving duty into lines that battle had already written. He had been taught that victory was the sum of right decisions. Now he suspected that even right decisions could break a civilization if enough of them demanded blood at once. Calgar slid on his helm and felt the familiar closeness of responsibility seal around him like armor, heavier than ceramite and less forgiving. He began to measure not targets, but losses, and then to measure what would be left standing, to carry those losses if he dared to win. He walked the nave to the statue of Robuta and let silence test his resolve. There was comfort in marble, and also accusation. You are the heir of a standard that cannot be carried by a man alone, the still face seemed to say. Calgar bowed his helm to the cold stone and prayed for clarity instead of triumph. Inquisitor Cryptman's voice came to him on a ribbon of static from far, bitter space. Behemoth is not a war, Lord of Macragge. It is an appetite. Do not feed it battles it can learn from. Calgar heard the warning and felt its edge cut both ways. Every defense would teach the swarm. Every abandonment would teach his people fear. Duty does not permit retreat, he thought, but duty does not always permit standing still. He turned to his captains and spoke in the measured cadence that kept panic from finding purchase. We will split the blade. The fleet will shape the approach, harry the bioships, and draw mass from the main vector before it makes atmosphere. The polar fortresses will stand as the anvil where our hammer must fail. He saw what that meant and did not look away. The first company would become a promise that other lives could keep. Down in the armoriums, serfs moved through incense and oil, measuring courage by tasks that shook their hands. A young artificer named Mara checked seals 3 times and then a 4th, whispering the names of brothers she would never call by their given names. She had been taught that the chapter is immortal and the marine is only a breath it takes. She wondered, with a guilt like theft, whether immortality might be a kind of loneliness. The first mycetic spores burned down like winter meteors and sent shock through the ice shelf. A second fall followed so swiftly that the horizon seemed to crumble. Macro batteries thumped a cadence that made teeth ache. At the southern pole, a line of auxilia recited oath lines over the wind, their voices pulled thin and long by distance. Calgar returned to the hololith and watched the outer beacons resolve the incoming into organs with engines. Between the larger masses flickered fainter shapes that might have been shadows or thoughts. Bleed the spear, he told himself. Make the hunger spend itself before it reaches the marrow. The north sent a brief hymn stab of vox, and then turned to grit. Sol Invictus, holding the northern fortress, had sealed the outer gates and was walking the inner lines like a priest inspecting reliquaries before a storm. Calgar could see him without seeing him. Ritual patience married to ferocious economy. Serenity that did not mistake softness for virtue. Hold until I call you back, he thought, and understood that he would never call. Thunderheads built over the poles, streaked with ion trails of descending pods. The void fight began as measured geometry and evolved, as all things do, into a negotiation between mass and will. Calgar listened for the shape of the swarm's thought in the chaos and heard only appetite adjusting its teeth. He ran his internal ledger. If I must spend the first to keep the world, I will also spend my name to admit what the cost was. Duty has a right to truth. Now hope was a colder metal. Not that things would be fine, but that they could be born. He gave the order to press and kept his voice even. The first planetfall that mattered came like a hand closing. Spore torrents thickened into corridors of descent, and along those corridors rode heavier shapes that cracked the ice with their arrival. The air turned to needles, to ash, to swarming noise. In the southern fortress, a chaplain walked a prayer through the vox to the auxilia holding the lower galleries. You stand where sons of Ultramar will stand forever, because forever is made of moments like this. Calgar sealed his gauntlets. He accepted the calculus that named his brothers as cost. Outside the shrine, the storm gave the mountain a voice. Above, the dying suns of a mauled arm of the galaxy went on setting and rising, as if the sky were the only thing that could afford indifference. He stepped toward war as if into cold water, intent on not shivering where anyone could see. Dawn drew a slow line across Macragge, light scraping along bastions until every parapet looked newly forged. Calgar received the night's reports without flinching, pickets scarred, stations roused to incense and code. Northern Auspex returns thickening into weather that smelled of meat. He paced the strategium like a knave before a funeral, palm grazing the hololith to feel the cold of fate. Victory had always been a sum of right decisions. Now the sum itself felt sharp enough to cut what it meant to protect. In the armorium, Maradace moved through aisles of blue with the quiet of a librarian among dangerous books. Her tape measured not cloth, but myth, the spans of Terminator plate that had outlived fathers of men, now born and dying beneath the same banners. She checked seals, ferried ammunition drums, and learned courage from veterans' gentle talk. Campfires in training caverns, the civility of polishing a blade you intend to bloody. On her bench lay a strip of vellum. She wrote 3 names and pressed wax, pattern, not luck, and fixed it inside a breastplate where no one but the armor would know. Sol Invictus toured the northern fortress with a silence other men would spend on prayer. He tapped bulkheads like a surgeon testing bone, listened to barrel harmonics as crews cycled macro batteries, and walked firing lanes with a mason's eye for angles. Corridors here were instruments to be played at catastrophic volume, and he meant to perform them to the last note. His orders had the clarity of last wills: conserve, interlock, fall back by design. Burn what you cannot carry, deny memory to the Devourer. Calgar gathered his captains beneath the marble gaze of the Primarch. The hololith painted their armor with cold aurora, while fleet icons drifted like patient fish across a net of coordinates. We cut without severing, he said. Cruisers and barges will pressure the approach vector in staggered strikes. We will not chase intelligence the swarm wants us to learn, only bleed mass and break cohesion. The fortresses are our certainty. If a line must be written, it is written there. He did not add what he knew, Some lines are written in names and never erased. On the southern ice, an auxiliary lieutenant named Corin Fail stood in a trench whose walls were old ice and new prayer. He counted rations and shells twice, then a third time with his eyes closed, as if numbers might change when unwatched. Across the trench, a veteran with a face like dried leather told a story about his child collecting blue stones because they looked like parade colors. The tale entered Fail's bones like medicinal heat. He resolved to survive, not for banners, but for the next unremarkable morning when a child's pockets might be heavy again. The first pressure arrived near midday. A broad hand laid flat upon everything. Vox static thickened, Auspex returns flickered like fish in a black river, and the sky took on gradients of motion that belonged to nothing born here. Calgar tracked the shapes with a fencer's focus. The swarm was not probing, it was calibrating, and calibration meant thought. Stagger the intercepts, he ordered, and the fleet answered with disciplined violence. Lances stitched the void, torpedoes prowled, escorts cut wakes into knife-edged corridors, then vanished before the teeth could close. At the fortress, Invictus felt it before he saw it, a weight at the edges of perception, like weather changing in a room without windows. He flooded tertiary galleries with coolant mist, rotated devastators along pre-marked bracketing points, and set chaplains to pace the inner ring with quiet litany. You are not defending a place, one intoned, voice like gravel rolled in oil. You are defending the memory that places deserve. Men listened because the words moved at the same speed as their fear. Mara found herself briefly alone, palms flat against a breastplate that had survived a dozen campaigns. She thought of what immortality becomes when worn too long, how it can harden into a museum that looks like a man. She tightened a locking ring until the metal sang, then checked it twice more. The habits of survival are small and repeatable. She repeated them and felt, for a moment, less afraid. The void fight changed key like a song discovering its chorus. The swarm began to refuse losses that would teach it nothing, flowing around kill zones and regrouping along lines without a visible leader. Calgar recognized the signature of a mind, not yet a face, but a consensus quickening. He pictured the polar fortresses as eyes, and the thought that looked back through them as a pupil narrowing to study him. Circe remains our trap, a Vox adept ventured. Calgar shaped hope into orders and widened the fleet's arc, striking and fading, testing where appetite ended and will began. The first mycetic torrent to truly target the northern fortress fell in a columned roar, pods slamming like pile drivers through the ice and bursting into corridors with the indecency of sudden birth. Invictus met them with geometry that felt preordained. Choke, scythe, seal, burn, reopen. Tyranids answered with learning. Those that died arranged themselves into lessons for the living. The battle narrowed until it felt like two hands, fingers intertwined, not embracing, but testing each other's grip for weakness. In the southern galleries, Fail led a countercharge that was less a surge than a disciplined step forward. Flamers made brief summers in long winter halls. Bolters hammered a rhythm men could breathe to. In 10 minutes of careful killing, he learned that his hands would not shake if he kept remembering who he had decided to be an hour earlier. He made that decision again and again until the corridor smelled of chemicals and cooked chitin, and the floor shone like wet slate. Evening, if there is evening in a storm without sky, brought a pause. Not cessation, but the tempo change that means a conductor has raised his hand for a different passage. Calgar felt it in his bones. Invictus in the stillness of the mist, Mara in the hush that fell across the armorium when resupply carts paused. From the polar dark, something watched. Not yet the presence he feared, but the mask that would let it arrive with knowledge already held in its patient hunger. Calgar stood once more before Guilliman, helm crook-nested in his arm. "I will spend what you gave me," he said softly, "but I will not lie about the price." He imagined the chapter as a bridge over a chasm no map admitted. Bridges do not grieve. Those who cross them must. He ordered the fleet to strike and fade again, to refuse the duel the void kept offering, until the duel became inevitable on terms he chose, and on none other. Night at the poles is not darkness, but a flavor of cold. Within it, Invictus wrote a final addendum he did not expect to survive to deliver. The fortress is not a place. It is a promise held at gunpoint. He sealed the note and walked his lines. Mara slept 19 minutes sitting up, woke and resumed her pattern. Fail counted shells again. Above them all, the sky learned the names of men it would soon erase, and the names learned how to outlast being spoken. The storm over Macragge learned the cadence of the guns and began to breathe with them. Calgar stood inside his helm's hush and watched the hololith turn void to geometry, vectors of flesh braided into predictions that hated to be right. Every decision mortgaged a hallway he had not yet walked, a name he had not yet spoken. He placed escorts along knife corridors and let the cruisers rake and fade, teaching the swarm distance while refusing it lessons he could not afford. Strategy felt like a covenant with consequence. Consequence demanded payment more honest than hope. Somewhere beneath the mountain, the shrine lamps trembled as if the storm could enter stone, and he wondered whether marble ever envied men their ability to regret. He stood listening. In the armorium, Mara Dace made fear mechanical. She dragged a cloth along adamantine plate until her reflection sank into blue, more rumor than face. She checked a locking ring, checked it again, then touched the wax she had pressed inside a breastplate where only the armor would feel it. 3 names rested there at dawn. By midday she added a 4th in cramped hand. When macro batteries fired, the oil lamps shivered and settled, and she matched her breathing to the recoil of distant guns. Rituals shrank the world. Smallness, she found, was survivable. She worked until thinking quieted. Inside. Saul Invictus walked the northern fortress with an accountant's appetite for balance. Ammunition in, monsters out. Seconds banked, brothers repaid. Coolant mist lay along the floors like a low sea and turned bootsteps to whispers. He measured angles as a mason measures load, corrected a firing slit by a finger's width, and nodded when macro barrel harmonics sang clean. "Interlock by the mark," he told sergeants. "If you fall back, burn behind you. If you hold, hold as a wall holds. Quietly until there is no wall." Chaplains kept litanies cut to bone. Breathe, aim, serve. Between phrases, the fortress listened, patiently. Lieutenant Corin Fail paced the southern trench with a slate chained to his wrist and numbers gnawing at certainty. He recited section strengths by touch in the cold. 12, 11, 10, 12 again, because one man crawled back after being certain he was dead. The trench smelled of ration paste, promethium breath, and the coppery news the sky would soon deliver. A veteran told how his child collected blue stones because they looked like parade armor. Men listened as if the tale were a hot drink passed along a line. Fail wrote calmly, then let frost bite through faith. Gently. The void fight changed key without changing tempo. Lances stitched logic. Torpedoes prowled. Escorts cut wakes through living resin and vanished, before claws decided where to close. Calgar ordered a feint and cancelled it mid-syllable, as the swarm leaned to catch his meaning. Not yet a face, he thought, but a pressure with ideas. Do not duel, he told the fleet. Graze, bleed, deny. Obedience moved like current through hulls and souls. He widened the arc towards Circe and promised to keep that future only if the poles could afford his absence. A promise measured against breath. He believed it. By midday, the landfall that mattered arrived with the arrogance of inevitability. Mycetic spores turned air to gravel. The sky avalanched into cones of falling intent. Pods bit the crust and exhaled steam that smelled like wet teeth. Invictus did not blink. Geometry woke. Storm bolters wrote hard sentences through mist. Flamers made brief summers along galleries. Doors shut like verdicts. The Tyranids answered by arranging their dead into advice. The second wave found the first wave's bodies already pointing and learned. So the fortress learned them back, one measured syllable at a time. The ice held, complaining softly. Once, Mara ran a corridor with ammunition drums staggered across her spine and a ridiculous thought about an unfinished letter that kept returning like a sparrow. A Terminator paced beside her for 6 steps and then was elsewhere, with the instant grace of enormous mass used correctly. A vent coughed furnace air. Something skittered at the edge of vapor and did not move like anything that had ever been born. She slid a drum into a hungry cradle and felt the weapon purr. For 6 breaths, she believed in machines more than prayer. On the 7th, she whispered anyway, very quietly. Fail's platoon advanced, because advancing was the only way to keep the corridor from becoming a grave that remembered their names. Flamers turned the first rank of gaunts to sugar glass. Bayonets taught the second rank that men had opinions about distance. A guardsman fell without sound. Another man finished his prayer line for him without missing a beat. Fail discovered a fatal arithmetic. Rage misses, discipline kills. He borrowed steadiness from the sergeant on his left and loaned it to the private on his right, and the line walked forward as if wearing one spine the whole length. Together. Far above, escorts lunged in a curve that suggested flight, and then closed like a smile without warmth. 2 bioships ruptured into constellations of meat and fire. A third birthed drones that ate an escort to bones and ash. We have not lost a ship, a Vox adept began, but Calgar corrected the tense because language is duty. We have lost a ship, he said. We will not lose the next. He felt the words lock into the deck like anchors, and new anchors could be lifted only by hands that kept their honesty, even bleeding. He kept his balance anyway. Evening had no sky to stain, only the backs of clouds scabbed with ash. Invictus authorized the first planned withdrawal and sealed a corridor with Prometheum and him. He signed the order, knowing gates. Once burned, do not return. At a landing, he paused by a brass plate engraved with old campaigns and let one gauntlet rest against names that had already kept many promises. We are keeping one more, he told the metal, and kept walking, boots whispering in the mist, spine straight. He saved nothing for himself except accuracy, the last mercy duty allows. He recorded the silence. The ridge that guarded the southern pass rose like a frozen scar, its walls ribbed with trenches and the bones of machines older than the war itself. The wind there moved like a whisper among the dead, carrying the faint reek of promethium and oil, a smell that would soon belong to fire. Calgar stood beneath a sky glazed in ash and aurora, watching the first line of bane blades churn the snow into vapor. Cold Steel Ridge had been a mining range once, then a fortress, then a graveyard for those who mistook geography for safety. Today, it would become a sermon. "Anchor the armor in pairs," Calgar ordered. His voice carried through vox like iron dragged across stone. They die together, or they live together. No one dies alone. Around him, the third company moved in orchestrated silence, their blue and gold reduced to shadow and reflection under the lightless sky. The guns spoke before the men did, a single thunderous measure that made the mountain breathe. It was not hope they carried now, but procedure. Hope had no geometry. In the trench below, Lieutenant Fail wiped a crust of frost from his lashes and peered into the waste where the horizon rippled like liquid glass. The Auspex gave only noise, a symphony of ghosts, yet every man felt it before the signal confirmed. The slow approach of many limbs in perfect rhythm. "They're coming," whispered the veteran beside him. Fail didn't answer. He just reached into his coat and touched the small blue stone his daughter had given him, smooth and cold against the skin of his palm. The storm above began to pulse with color, and the air filled with the low hum of descending mass. When the first wave struck, the world bent. Mycetic pods plunged through the sky like nails driven by a patient god. Each impact rippled through the ridge, knocking snow from ledges and dust from the bones of the mountain. The bane blades opened their maws and sang in flame. Calgar felt the shock through his armor's soles, through the teeth of his gauntlets, through the deep ache that sat behind his heart. The Tyranids came not as soldiers, but as weather, a biological flood whose logic was consumption. Their claws found purchase on the slope and dragged them upward in silent frenzy. He descended into the comms pit, watching the engagements bloom as heat signatures on the hololith. "Focus fire, choke them in the gullies," he commanded. "If they reach the ridge, you burn the ridge." The order hung like a sentence, understood but unspoken. On another channel, Invictus reported that the north still held. For now, the fortresses stood like teeth in a starving mouth. "Then we make them chew," Calgar replied. For hours, the battle behaved like mathematics. Angles, trajectories, predictable loss. Then it learned. The second wave came lower, faster, masked by the ruin of the first. Raveners tunneled through permafrost beneath the ridge and erupted behind the lines in a bloom of claws. Fail's platoon turned as one, flamers sweeping arcs that drew molten paths across the ice. The smell of burning alien ichor met the clean scent of frost and turned it to poison. Fail shouted for reserves, but the vox was full of screaming static. In the roar of battle, he thought he heard the mountain whisper his name. Calgar moved to the front line in a storm of debris, his armor scored and smoking from a near miss. His honor guard surrounded him like fragments of a broken sun, each movement timed to the other's breath. He waded into the swarm with calm precision, every strike a punctuation mark in a sentence too vast for words. A carnifex surged from the mist, armor plates glistening with the sheen of half-frozen blood. Calgar met it like a judge. His gauntlets of Ultramar tore through its chest and shattered the organs within. Its roar died before the sound could reach the air. Around him, his men fought not for victory, but for measurement. How long, how deep, how wide before the inevitable collapse? In orbit, the fleet mirrored the struggle. Strike cruisers dipped into atmosphere to unleash plasma storms before pulling back into the void, trails of fire tracing the outline of a dying hope. The swarm responded by birthing new shapes mid-air, winged organisms that bled acid as they fell, turning the snowfields below into bubbling pools. Each death enriched the enemy. Each victory instructed it further. By evening, the ridge was a silhouette against the aurora, its outline trembling with the rhythm of bombardment. Fail's trench had ceased to exist. He fought now among ruins that no longer had names. He fired until the barrel of his weapon glowed red, then used it like a club. When the last of his men fell, he lifted the blue stone to the sky and smiled through blood-flecked teeth. The next moment took him. Calgar saw the gap open in the ridge defense and signaled retreat, his voice steady but his chest hollow. Pull back to the secondary line. The ridge is spent. The words were surgical, without indulgence. Around him, Thunderhawk screamed overhead, dragging wounded and ammunition toward what remained of the South Fortress. He stayed until the last squad cleared, then turned his gaze toward the horizon. Amid the static of snow and spores, a shape rose, a larger organism, not yet distinct, but tall enough to distort the clouds around it. He felt the instinctive recognition of a predator meeting another that thought itself older. As the Bane blades detonated in self-immolation to deny the enemy their carcasses, the night lit itself in morning colors. Blue, gold, and violet shimmered through the mist, as if the sky remembered what they had been before the killing. Calgar stood inside that light and listened to the silence between explosions. The line was gone, yet something inside him refused to call it defeat. The dead had bought time. Time was the only currency the living could still spend. He keyed the fortress vox one last time. "Invictus," he said quietly, voice carried on a thread of static. "The ridge has fallen. Hold your ground. Whatever comes next, make it remember." Then he turned toward the waiting Thunderhawk, smoke curling through the air like breath from a tired god, and stepped inside. As the craft lifted from the ruins, he looked down upon Cold Steel Ridge, once a fortress, now a wound on the face of the world, and understood that every wall he built was a promise the universe would one day collect. The Thunderhawk clawed through sleet and ash, its engines shuddering under the burden of wounded men and unresolved orders. Calgar stood in the hold, one hand braced against the bulkhead, watching sparks drift like embers from the armor of those who had survived Cold Steel Ridge. The air smelled of coolant and blood, both metallic and strangely human. He could still hear the rhythm of the Baneblade's death throes beneath the storm, a slow percussion fading into memory. Beneath his boots, the deck trembled with every heartbeat of the ship, each pulse echoing the question he would not let himself ask. How much of Macragge remained to save? Above the storm front, the void unfolded into a bruised tapestry of fire. Fragments of wreckage spun like unburied bones. Voidcraft bled vapor into vacuum as the swarm regrouped, its fleets folding inward as though drawing breath. Calgar's voice was measured when he spoke. "Status of the North," Static answered. Then, faintly, Invictus's tone, ragged but unbroken. "Holding. For now." Those two words carried the weight of a planet. The vox cut again before he could reply. He stood very still, as if stillness might hold the world in place. The Thunderhawk broke through the upper atmosphere and found the fleet burning in slow motion. Cruisers drifted half silent, their hulls etched with the scars of learning. Each scar a lesson the swarm had already understood. The Octavius, Calgar's flagship, loomed ahead, its dorsal batteries cooling from their last exchange. As the Thunderhawk locked into the hangar cradle, crews bowed in silence. None saluted. Formalities had become superstition, and superstition was spent. Inside the strategium, the air was thin with ozone and tension. Hololiths flared with red constellations, each a distress call unresolved. Calgar removed his helm and felt the exhaustion crawl into his eyes. "We move to intercept in orbit," he said, voice hoarse but firm. If the poles fall, Macragge falls with them. We will make the sky their tomb. Officers around him nodded, not because they believed, but because disbelief was a luxury none could afford. Cripman's last transmission replayed through the comms, distorted by distance and death. Do not feed it battles it can learn from. The words threaded through Calgar's thoughts like a contagion. But what else could be done? To retreat was to abandon billions. To stand was to give the swarm new data, new ways to kill. Somewhere between those truths waited the cost no strategist could calculate. Down in the fortress of the north, Saul Invictus walked the corridors between detonations. The walls themselves seemed to sweat with condensation and blood. Every light flickered as if uncertain whether to illuminate the scene before it. His men were shadows in fog, their armor dulled by frost and exhaustion. Between barrages, the silence became unbearable. He broke it with orders. Rearm, redistribute ammunition, treat the wounded you can carry, burn what you can't. A nod, a chorus of muted affirmations. Duty had narrowed to arithmetic. He passed through the chapel, where a chaplain recited the litany of endurance in a voice too calm for the dying. Candles had melted into pools of wax that looked like snowdrifts. Invictus knelt for a single breath, then rose. His faith was a tool, not an answer. Faith bought time. Time was all they sold. Macragge stumbled through the lower corridors, guiding servitors laden with fresh ammunition toward the outer galleries. The floors trembled under the pounding of distant artillery. In her mind, she tried to reconstruct the shape of Cold Steel Ridge as she had last seen it. White, precise, clean against the sky. Now it was gone. Every echo in the fortress felt heavier, as though carrying ghosts in its throat. She handed out drum magazines with the efficiency of someone who had learned how to stop feeling while the world burned around her. A Marine paused long enough to touch the wax seal she wore around her neck, a token of the dead, and nodded once before returning to the line. Above, the battle in orbit unfolded like a wound, opening wider. Calgar's fleet struck and vanished, hit and bled, a dance of attrition choreographed by despair. A torpedo lance scored through a cluster of bioships, turning them to plasma. Another swarm replaced them before the light faded. Calgar's voice carried over the voxnet like a hymn written for machines. Fire and fade, never linger. Deny them purchase. Yet each command came slower, quieter, as if each syllable cost him more breath than the last. From his command pulpit, he could see the planet's horizon burning. Ice sheets shattered under orbital strikes. The northern hemisphere glowed faintly where the fortresses spat light into storm. His mind drifted, unbidden, to the marble face beneath the mountain. Guilliman, frozen between thought and eternity. Did statues dream? Did they forgive? He wondered if the Primarch's eyes, locked forever open, could still see what the Imperium had become, men dying so that memory could survive another hour. The swarm adjusted its pattern. A Leviathan creature, vast enough to shadow half the fleet, began exhaling clouds of spores that gleamed like ink in vacuum. The Octavius shuddered under the impact of 1,000 microscopic impacts, hull plates corroding to mirror polish. Calgar gave the order. All ships, break orbit, draw them into the upper atmosphere. Ground batteries will engage as they descend. It was a terrible gamble, trading the void for air, but the void no longer belonged to them. In the fortress, Invictus received the order in clipped vox tones. Understood, he said. To his men, prepare for the rain. They tightened seals, wiped fog from visors, and braced as the ceiling thundered with impacts. Spores the size of tanks burst through layers of armor and concrete, disgorging nightmares with too many limbs and not enough hesitation. Invictus moved among his brothers like gravity itself, each gesture a command. Bolters roared, flamers shrieked, the corridors filled with light. Mara watched the first breach open and felt the wind rush past her, as if the world itself were inhaling. She ducked under a claw that could have cut her in two, pulled a fallen marine's pistol from his gauntlet, and fired until the clip sang empty. The creature fell, its body collapsing into a pool of acid that hissed through the floor. Her skin blistered. She did not stop. Around her, the fortress became a cathedral of noise. By the time the last spore burst, the polar night had turned the battlefield into glass. In the void above, Calgar's ships retreated beyond the thermosphere, their silhouettes fading against the stars. He watched the readouts blur with static, the fortress Vox falling silent one sector at a time. He pressed his palm to the hololith, as if the act could hold them together. "Hold!" he whispered to ghosts who could no longer hear. Below, Invictus raised his sword to the flickering light and spoke a single word into the storm. "Endure!" Then the next wave hit, and the world answered. The dawn over Macragge never came. Only a dim bruise of light spread through the storm, an imitation of morning crafted by fire. The sky was swollen with spore clouds that bled color into the air, turning every breath to acid mist. Calgar stood upon the command deck of the Octavius, the viewport fractured by micro-impacts, each crack veined with frost. Below him, the planet smoldered like a forge where hope was melted down for ammunition. He had learned to stop looking for victories. Now he looked only for meaning in the way things broke. Transmission from the northern fortress, a Vox officer reported, voice thin and shaking. Calgar turned, the servo motors of his armor whispering in sympathy. The feed came alive in snow and noise. Through it, fragments of Invictus's voice struggled to form coherence, orders drowned beneath the thunder of collapse. Then the screen steadied just long enough to show the captain standing amidst ruins, his armor cracked, his banner shredded to ribbons of blue. "We still hold," Invictus said. "But they've begun tunneling beneath the ice. The swarm learns. It learns us." The signal died before Calgar could answer. He closed his eyes and bowed his head for a single heartbeat. "Prepare the evacuation corridor," he said quietly. "The fortress will not last the day." His adjutants exchanged glances, the kind that sought mercy where none lived. "My lord, if we abandon the pole—" "We are not abandoning," Calgar interrupted. "We are withdrawing to fight again. Survival is not surrender." The words carried the weight of doctrine, but his tone betrayed the ache of knowing how rarely survival obeyed command. In the bowels of the fortress, Maradace ran through smoke-choked tunnels where the air shimmered with heat and ash. The walls trembled with each distant explosion, dust falling like grey rain. She clutched a data slate against her chest, its cracked surface glowing faintly with the coordinates of the last functioning hangar. Her lungs burned, every breath tasted of ozone and metal. Around her, servitors stumbled under the weight of crates, their faces blistered by the same heat that made her vision blur. Ahead, a gate lay half collapsed, light leaking through its seams like the breath of another world. She kept moving. On the ridge above, Invictus commanded what remained of the first company. They had drawn back to the inner walls, their armor blackened, their voices hoarse. He could no longer hear the storm beyond the noise of chitin striking ceramite. 1,000 claws composing a single sentence that ended with hunger. "Line 3, close ranks," he bellowed. His sword sang through the fog. cutting arcs of blue fire. A Tyranid warrior crashed against him, its talons piercing his pauldron. He answered by driving his blade through its skull and twisting until both were locked in stillness. He kicked it free, breathing in the silence that followed. "We are the wall," he said, almost softly. "And walls do, and not plead." Outside, the swarm advanced in patterns too deliberate to be instinct. Bio-titans lumbered through the snowfields, their steps shaking mountains, while smaller creatures scurried in their shadow, like thoughts around a great mind. The horizon pulsed with phosphorescent veins, the hive fleet's synapse reaching through atmosphere like roots through water. The Swarm Lord was near now, its presence felt in every hesitation, every counter that came too quickly. Invictus could sense it, though he could not name the shape. It was intelligence distilled into cruelty, patience made physical. Far above, Calgar oversaw the descent of the relief wings. Dropships broke through the storm in streaks of light, carving temporary corridors between heaven and the hell beneath. Thunderhawks escorted them, cannons flaring against the sky. The Vox crackled with overlapping prayers and screams. "Target the breach west of the fortress," Calgar ordered. "Buy them time to reach the hangars." The ships obeyed, but the swarm's reaction was immediate. Organic artillery bloomed like ulcers on the ice, hurling spore pods that tore hulls apart before they could land. One Thunderhawk spiraled out of formation, a comet trailing debris and voices until it vanished behind a wall of smoke. Calgar did not look away. Mara reached the hangar as the ceiling cracked open in a rain of molten steel. Inside, fragments of ultramarine blue lay scattered among wrecked servitors and the ghosts of engines. A surviving pilot waved her forward. "Hurry!" he shouted, voice raw. She threw the data slate onto the console, its coordinates flashing red. "This is the evacuation grid," she gasped. "The north walls won't hold." He looked at her, at the grime and blood streaked across her face, at the resolve that refused to surrender, and nodded. The ship roared to life, its thrusters screaming, as if unwilling to leave the dead behind. Invictus watched the sky open above him and understood the meaning of endurance. It was not defiance, it was acceptance, that every stand ends in collapse, and that collapse, too, can be holy. Around him, his brothers fought in silence now, voices gone, prayers spent. The fortress groaned like a wounded leviathan as the tunnels beneath gave way. The floor heaved, cracking along seams of fire. He turned to the Vox operator. "Transmit to the Lord of Macragge," he said. "Tell him we are keeping his promise." The operator tried to speak, but only static answered. Invictus smiled through the blood on his lips and raised his blade once more. The evacuation ships ascended through a cyclone of debris. From orbit, the planet appeared as a single burning wound, polar regions glowing white against the black. Calgar watched the last telemetry from the fortress fade into nothing. He did not speak for a long time. Around him, the officers worked in silence, unwilling to disturb the grief that filled the air like gravity. Finally, he said, "They held long enough." It was neither eulogy nor excuse, but something colder, more necessary. A statement of fact the universe could not contradict. In the darkness below, Invictus faced the thing that had learned him. The Swarm Lord stepped through the shattered wall, its claws gleaming with reflected fire. Its gaze, alien yet purposeful, met his. There was no language between them, only understanding. The captain lowered his stance, blade steady. "Remember," he whispered, and charged. The duel that followed was unseen by any living witness, but the echoes carried through the stone for hours after. When silence finally reclaimed the fortress, the wind returned. It moved through corridors of ash and ruin, lifting banners that no longer had colour, brushing against the marble plaques of names newly carved by fire. Somewhere within the dying mountain, a single candle guttered and went out. In orbit, Calgar turned from the viewport. "Begin the counter-offensive," he said. His voice was low, even, heavy with ghosts. The engines of the fleet ignited like stars reborn, their light scattering across the void as if refusing to admit that night had won. The fleet drifted above Macragge, like a ring of half-extinguished candles, their flames bending inward to the gravity of loss. Calgar stood upon the bridge of the Octavius, helmet locked beneath his arm, the lights from tactical displays washing his features in alternating blue and red. Below him, the planet still bled from the poles, two wounds that would never close. The counteroffensive had begun, yet the word offensive felt obscene. There was no direction left to move that did not end in ash. "Enemy formations shifting," reported a lieutenant. "They're drawing up from the surface, abandoning atmosphere." Calgar's gaze narrowed. The Hive fleet's logic was unnervingly deliberate. "They know," he murmured. "They've consumed enough to adapt. They'll meet us where we believe ourselves strongest." Around him, the command crew prepared for the next exchange, their motions precise, almost devotional. They had learned, as he had, that precision was the only prayer that still answered. The first salvo came from the swarm, lances of bioplasma scarring the dark. One blast struck the Octavius broadside, sending a tremor through the deck. Consoles flared, alarms wailed, and the acrid scent of ozone replaced the filtered air. Calgar steadied himself. "Return fire by sectors," he ordered. "No pursuit. Bleed them where they linger." The fleet responded in disciplined arcs, shells of light tracing mathematical perfection through chaos. For a brief span, the void resembled order again. Below, the polar fortress was silent. No signals, no heat, only the skeletal glow of molten trenches. The northern hemisphere looked almost peaceful from orbit, a false calm drawn over the dead. Calgar knew Invictus's body lay somewhere beneath that serenity, perhaps locked in, frozen embrace with the creature that had ended him. He could not decide which fate was crueler, to die remembered or to be absorbed into memory until nothing distinct remained. He envied neither. The battle drifted outward into the upper exosphere, a slow ballet of annihilation. Ships maneuvered in near silence, their engines muted to conserve power, the only sound the internal thrum of reactors and the thin pulse of hearts. Across the Vox, Chaplain Cassius's voice recited the Canticle of Duty, a sound more mechanical than sacred. Steel is faith, fire is truth, endurance is worship. Calgar listened, not for comfort, but for rhythm. Words kept the hands from shaking. At the fleet's perimeter, the cruiser Gladius Morn took a direct hit and erupted into a bloom of orange and white. Thousands died in a moment, their sacrifice wordless but not meaningless. The shockwave shuddered across the void, rattling hulls like the heartbeat of a dying god. "Mark that vector," Calgar said. "Every death must teach." Yet he heard Cryptman's old warning, whispering at the edge of thought. Do not feed it battles it can learn from. The irony was bitter as static on his tongue. Through the clouds of vaporized metal came something new. A silhouette vast enough to blot constellations, its contours shifting like liquid. The Swarm Lord's vessel, or perhaps the mind's avatar itself. A ripple passed through the swarm, coherence born of shared instinct. Calgar felt it before the senses did, a tightening of reality, the sense that the void itself had turned to regard him. All batteries, he commanded. On my mark. The mark came as a single word. Now. The void erupted. Plasma, melter, torpedo. Every instrument of humanity's defiance unleashed in unison. The creature's hull split open, disgorging rivers of glowing ichor that crystallized in the cold vacuum. For a moment, they believed it dying. Then the pieces moved. Limbs reformed from fragments, growing around the wounds, consuming wreckage to rebuild themselves. Calgar watched and understood. This was not repair. It was memory made flesh. The Octavius shuddered under counterfire. Hull breaches opened along the starboard decks, sucking crew into the dark. One of his honor guard, Brother Altheon, reached for a manual override and was torn from his harness by the decompression blast. Calgar caught only the echo of his shout before the silence claimed him. "Seal the compartment," he said quietly. "We grieve later." But grief was already here, breathing in the recycled air, hiding in every pause between orders. The fleet continued to fall back in organized retreat, luring the enemy toward Macragge's upper orbit, where the planet's gravity could serve as weapon. "If they follow, they'll burn," said an officer. Calgar nodded, though he knew the swarm did not fear burning. It feared nothing capable of teaching restraint. "Then we teach the lesson anyway." The fleet descended into the thin sheath of atmosphere, engines ablaze, drawing vapor trails that stitched across the night like veins of fire. Behind them, the hive fleet pursued, unaware or indifferent to the gravitational trap waiting below. In the fortress ruins, buried sensors still functioned. They detected the heat bloom of the descending fleets and began transmitting residual data through the ice, ghost codes echoing across the planet. Those fragments reached the Octavius as whispers of binary prayer. Mara Dace, now assigned to the ship's lower decks, heard them through the static of her console. The signals sounded like voices carried on wind, fragments of names, perhaps, or final blessings. She turned to the officer beside her. "The fortress is speaking," she said. He shook his head. "It's just interference." But she listened harder and thought she heard Invictus's voice beneath the static, repeating a single word. "Endure." Calgar gave the order to ignite the planet's upper defense grid. Ancient batteries buried beneath the crust awoke, their machine spirits howling in ancient tongues. Lances of plasma speared upward through cloud and ash, tearing into the swarm's underbelly. Bioships vaporized, spore fields ignited into miniature suns. The void became a storm of burning rain. Yet even destruction carried cost. The recoil shattered orbital stations, the shockwaves tearing friendly hulls apart. The sky wept fragments of both enemy and ally alike. When the fire faded, silence followed. Not peace, but exhaustion. The swarm had retreated, its coherence disrupted, its great vessel limping back toward the void. For the first time in days, the stars looked visible again. Calgar leaned against the hololith, eyes unfocused. "We hold Macragge," an officer whispered. But he could not feel victory, only vacancy. "We survive," he corrected. "Holding is for walls. We are what remains after walls fall." He turned toward the viewport. Beneath, the planet still burned in slow motion. Glaciers split by heat. Oceans choked in smoke. Somewhere in that inferno lay the bones of Invictus, of Vale, of countless others whose names would become numbers carved in brass. Calgar bowed his head, not in prayer, but in acknowledgement. "You held long enough," he said. "That will have to be enough." Outside, the debris of both fleets drifted together, indistinguishable in death, until the next tide of hunger found them. Circe hung ahead like a crown of broken glass, its rings glittering with the frozen remnants of ships long dead. The fleet moved toward it through a silence so absolute that even the groan of hulls under stress felt intrusive. Calgar watched from the observation deck, hands clasped behind his back, as fragments of ice reflected the light of burning engines. Each shard spun with hypnotic grace, a mirror to the void's indifference. The swarm had withdrawn toward the planet's shadow, but their absence was no mercy. It was the pause between inhalation and scream. Admiral Starn reports all squadrons in formation, came the Vox officer's voice. Outer batteries charged, targeting the residual mass trailing from Behemoth's main vector. Calgar nodded, eyes never leaving the rings. "We will draw them here," he said. "Let Circe be the anvil. The Imperium will be the hammer." His tone carried no triumph, only arithmetic necessity. The crew moved like men reciting scripture whose meaning they no longer believed. In the void beyond Circe, the first flickers appeared, distant motes of heat sliding through the cold. The swarm returned, not as a wave, but as a tide organized by hunger's will. Calgar felt the temperature in the chamber drop as though the void itself leaned closer to listen. "Signal the fleet," he said. "Pattern Sigma Tertius. Maintain spacing. No pursuit until my mark." Commands echoed down 100 channels, passed through human mouths and machine tongues, multiplying into the language of war. The opening volleys lit the dark in crimson arcs. Macro cannon fire raked through the leading bioships, tearing them into vapor before their drones could react. For the briefest moment, victory resembled something human, but Behemoth's nature was patient. From the carcasses of the dead, new shapes unfolded, smaller, faster, alive with instinct. They streaked through the debris field like insects through sunlight, and the illusion of advantage dissolved. "They learn," whispered the master of Vox. Calgar's eyes hardened. "Then let us teach harder lessons." Circe's rings caught the dying light and magnified it. Fragments of ice burned blue, drifting like ghosts between ships. The fleet pressed inward, engines flaring to maintain position within the storm of orbiting ruin. The swarm moved with them, drawing closer, no longer chasing but herding. Calgar sensed it, strategy, not instinct. He knew this shape, encirclement, a noose closing under the pretense of flight. "Admiral Starn," he called. "Cut thrust, prepare the Dominus Astra." The Admiral's voice arrived distorted but calm. "My lord, the ship's warp drives are damaged. She won't make translation." "She doesn't need to," Calgar replied. Silence followed, understanding born too quickly for comfort. Starn's next words came soft. "I, my lord, the Astra will serve." The line went dead. Below decks, Mara Dace worked among the ship's wounded, patching power lines and sealing ruptures where atmosphere fled in ribbons of frost. She heard the captain's orders through the Vox, but not their meaning. Around her, servitors whispered binary prayers, unaware that their world was being traded for time. The corridor shook as the Dominus Astra began its slow turn toward the heart of the swarm. Calgar watched the old battle barge glide from formation, its armor flaking under constant impact. A dozen smaller ships shifted to cover its wake, escorting it as one might escort a martyr to the altar. "All vessels, withdraw at 500,000 kilometers," Calgar commanded. "Do not break silence until after ignition." On the bridge, no one asked what ignition meant. Every officer present already knew. Inside the Dominus Astra, Admiral Starn knelt before the ship's reactor altar. His hand trembled only once as he placed the ignition key into the housing. The choir of engineers began their final hymn, voices merging with the rising pitch of the warp drive as it began to tear itself apart. For Ultramar, Starn whispered. Then light consumed everything. The detonation unfolded without sound. For a fraction of a second, Circe's rings burned brighter than suns, vaporizing debris, ships, and swarm alike in a wave of white fire. The void rippled as the warp imploded upon itself, dragging half the hive fleet into its mouth. Shockwaves tore through the remaining vessels, hurling even the Octavius into a violent spin. Every instrument screamed, every hull groaned, every prayer fractured into static. Yet when the light faded, the space around Circe was empty. Calgar clung to the edge of the command rail, his armor scorched by sparks. "Report," he rasped. "All systems failing," came the reply. "But the swarm, nothing remains." The words felt heavier than victory. Silence pressed upon them like the weight of aftermath. The hololith flickered to life again, showing the expanding wound where the warp implosion had scarred reality. A new star, artificial and malign, pulsed in Circe's orbit. "We'll name it Starn's Light," Calgar said. "Let it remind the galaxy what light costs." Hours passed. The fleet drifted among fragments of melted ice and twisted hulls. Rescue teams combed the wreckage, finding only echoes and static. In one of the lower decks, Mara stared through a cracked viewport at the distant glow of the implosion scar. It pulsed with slow rhythm, like a heartbeat no one could claim. "We lived," said the crewman beside her. She shook her head. "We survived. That's not the same thing." Her voice trembled, but the truth in it did not. Calgar walked alone through the observation chamber, armor blackened, hands bare. Outside, the light of Circe's wound spilled across his face, painting him in a color that was neither red nor gold, but something between, the hue of sacrifice too bright to name. He thought of Invictus, of Fail, of the fortress buried under its own ashes. He thought of the swarm, of hunger learning patience. Victory felt like being allowed to remember the dead a little longer before joining them. "Lord of Macragge," came Cassius's voice from the Vox. "The swarm is broken. Should we pursue?" Calgar looked once more at the scar blooming over Circe and answered softly, "No, let them retreat. Even hunger must rest before it learns again." He ended the channel and turned away. Behind him, Circe burned quietly in its orbit, a monument made of light and ruin. The fleet formed around it, diminished but alive, their engines whispering psalms of exhaustion. Somewhere in the deep dark, the remnants of Behemoth fled, already adapting, already dreaming of return. For a time, though, the galaxy exhaled, and Macragge was left to its silence. The silence that followed Circe's firestorm lingered longer than any victory cheer could. The fleet hung scattered, bruised silhouettes against a pale wound of light. On the command bridge of the Octavius, the air felt heavier than gravity, laden with the ghost of Admiral Starn's last transmission. The hololith flickered weakly, painting Calgar's armor in dull reflections of the destruction he had ordered. Beyond the viewport, the glow of Starn's light pulsed once every few seconds, a heartbeat too slow to belong to anything living. Reports came in fractured tones, systems crippled, ammunition spent, casualties beyond recording. The voices that delivered them no longer sought affirmation. They were cataloguing absence. "We will regroup at Macragge orbit," Calgar said at last. "All ships capable of thrust fall back to the planet's plane. Recover what remains." His words carried the brittle calm of command that had learned the futility of reassurance. The crew obeyed with the precision of exhaustion. Engines flared like sighs. The stars shifted. Hours folded into themselves. The swarm's signal had gone dark, but no one trusted silence from something born to consume. Beneath the quiet, the void still felt watched. Calgar stood alone on the observation deck, helmet removed, the cold bleeding through his scarred skin. He had imagined once that victory would sound like hymns. Instead, it was the absence of screaming. He thought of Invictus, the man who had built walls from flesh and will, and wondered if the captain had felt the same when the final breach came. Endurance was its own cruelty. To endure meant surviving long enough to name the dead. At the lower decks, Mara Dace sat beside the viewport of the auxiliary chapel. The light from Circe's wound illuminated her hands, still stained with oil and blood. Around her, crewmen whispered prayers, some to the Emperor, others to memory itself. She no longer prayed aloud. The language of faith had begun to sound too much like the language of orders. In the silence, she replayed the last sound from the northern fortress, the clipped voice saying we are keeping his promise, and found that it haunted her less as tragedy, more as instruction. To keep a promise, one had to remain alive. Back at Macragge, the planetary sensors flickered to life as the battered fleet re-entered its orbit. The polar regions were unrecognizable. The ice had melted into black seas that steamed with the ghosts of toxins and ash. Of the northern fortress, only skeletal outlines remained. Melted corridors, slagged battlements, a geometry of ruin. Calgar ordered silence on all channels as the fleet passed over the poles. Even the machine spirits obeyed, their hum subdued, as if unwilling to disturb the graves below. Chaplain Cassius stood beside Calgar at the viewport. His armor was cracked, his crozius dented, but his voice retained the rough gravity of conviction. They died as ultramarines should, he said. Calgar did not turn. They died as men must. Cassius frowned at the distinction, but said nothing. Some truths were not meant for argument. The Octavius began its slow descent through the thinning upper atmosphere. Fires still burned across the polar scars, licking upward as if reaching for forgiveness. Calgar stared at the landscape that had once been fortress and temple. "Land us," he said. "I will walk where they fell." The landing thrusters screamed against the wind, scattering ash and shards of metal like black snow. When the ramp lowered, the smell of burnt ozone and frozen death rushed in. Calgar stepped down into the ruin, each footfall echoing in the hollowness of a world that had forgotten sound. His escort followed at a respectful distance. The ground was glass in places, molten earth cooled into translucent veins that caught the dull light from above. Through them, he could see the faint shadows of what lay beneath, Terminator armor fused with alien bone, swords still clutched in what had once been hands. He knelt, one gauntlet brushing the scorched surface. The heat had long faded, yet the memory of it lingered in the texture of the stone. Around him, the remnants of banners lay tangled with spore tendrils, both reduced to the same colourless dust. Cassius spoke behind him, quietly reciting the Catechism of Remembrance. Calgar interrupted. "No, not words. Names." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind dragging through broken metal. Then Cassius began to speak the names of the first company. One by one, each name was carried into the air, like an offering. Calgar joined him, his voice low, each syllable deliberate. The wind took them both and scattered them among the ruins, ensuring that even if the galaxy forgot, the world beneath their feet would not. When the recitation ended, Calgar rose. "Build no monument," he said. "The planet itself is their shrine. He turned toward the shattered horizon, where the aurora had begun to reappear, muted colors dancing weakly through smoke. Let memory serve where stone cannot. Cassius bowed, understanding. Back aboard the ship, Mara watched the descent through the observation glass. From her vantage, the surface looked peaceful now, almost beautiful in its simplicity, an expanse of quiet blue-grey rimmed with the faint light of dawn. She knew better. Beauty in war was always a lie told by distance. She whispered one name, not for the dead, but for herself, and returned to her station. That night's cycle, Calgar sat alone in the strategium. The hololith projected the damaged star maps, the shifting scars of Circe's explosion, and the Aim-Okis, faint spectral trails of the retreating swarm. Each marker felt like a question he could not yet answer. The Imperium would call it a victory. The High Lords would inscribe it in records as proof of faith rewarded. He would sign their reports, but his own truth would remain unspoken. The Imperium survived not through faith or destiny, but because enough men and women refused to die on schedule. He rose and approached the viewport once more. The stars burned quietly, indifferent witnesses to all wars, past and waiting. Below, Macragge glimmered like a wounded jewel, its light dim but unextinguished. They endured, he murmured. The words carried neither comfort nor pride, only acknowledgement. Endurance was not glory, it was debt. As the Octavius drifted into night orbit, the last fragments of the Hive Fleet's trail faded beyond detection. In the silence that followed, a single truth remained. Victory was not the absence of the enemy. It was the decision to continue breathing in a galaxy that had forgotten mercy. Calgar closed his eyes and let the silence hold him. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to feel the weight of survival, and it was heavier than any armor he had ever worn. The air inside the Octavius was still, the silence of machines between heartbeats. Calgar stood in the stratagem, where the hololith now projected only a faint shimmer of static. Circe's scar still pulsing in its slow rhythm across the void. The data feeds had quieted, not for lack of information, but because the universe itself seemed to have paused to take stock of what remained. He traced the air with his gauntleted hand, drawing invisible lines through the light, as if rearranging the constellations could make their losses mean something more coherent. Outside the viewport, the black expanse rippled faintly with the wake of ships still limping home, their hulls torn and lights dim. Victory had no shape, only exhaustion. The doors opened behind him. Cassius entered, his steps measured, his armor newly repaired, but carrying the smell of burnt oil and sanctified incense. "The fleet is stable," he reported. "Repairs continue. Spirits are quiet." He hesitated before adding, "The men await your words, my lord. They wish to hear the meaning of this day." Calgar's gaze remained on the stars. "Meaning," he repeated softly, as if testing the word. "Do they think there is one?" Cassius bowed his head. "Without meaning, they will make ghosts of themselves before the next war finds them." Calgar exhaled, the sound more weary than resigned. "Then let them believe the meaning still exists. I will speak when the planet wakes." The ship's descent through atmosphere was slow, reverent. Macragge had begun to heal itself in the way that wounded worlds do, by forgetting what they were before. The southern hemisphere gleamed with thawed seas that reflected light like broken mirrors. The polar scars remained dark, a vast mosaic of glass and ruin. From orbit, they looked almost beautiful, an artist's interpretation of loss. As the Octavius descended, thunder rolled across the horizon, shaking the clouds loose of ash. The planet was weeping in weather. In the hangar bays, soldiers gathered around damaged banners, their ceramite armor streaked with soot and silence. They spoke little. Some wrote names upon walls. Others cleaned weapons that would not be fired again. Macragge moved among them, distributing ration packs and water as if performing a liturgy. Each man she passed looked both alive and absent, his gaze fixed inward. She understood that expression. It was the look of someone calculating whether survival had been worth its price. Calgar stepped onto the planet's surface once more, the wind biting at his armor. The sky was streaked in color, red, violet, the faintest gold of dawn breaking through old smoke. In the distance, the ruins of the fortress stood like teeth gnawed by time. Around him, a silent procession of Ultramarines followed, bearing reliquaries fashioned from recovered fragments of armor, weapons, and melted banners. They would be sealed within vaults beneath the mountain, not to glorify victory, but to teach what its cost had been. He halted beside what had once been the outer wall of the fortress. Only the foundation remained, fused into a black ridge that glowed faintly with residual heat. Calgar knelt and pressed his gauntlet to the stone. Beneath his hand, the ground still vibrated faintly, as if remembering the rhythm of the battle that had consumed it. "We are here," he said quietly. "You are not forgotten." The words fell into the wind and were carried across the wasteland like sparks that refused to die. Behind him, Cassius raised the Crozius and began the hymn of mourning. The voices of the assembled warriors joined in, low and hollow, echoing through the broken halls. The sound reached the distant cliffs and returned softer, as if the world itself were answering. Calgar listened, head bowed. He thought of Invictus standing before the final breach, of Fail clutching the blue stone, of Admiral Starn kneeling before the reactor altar. None of them had asked for remembrance. They had asked only that the Imperium survive long enough to matter. When the hymn ended, Cassius approached. "What will we tell Terra?" Calgar looked toward the horizon, where sunlight finally touched the edge of the ice fields. "Tell them the truth," he said, "that we endured, that endurance was enough." Cassius hesitated, then nodded slowly. "And what of the swarm?" "It will return," Calgar said. "All hungers do. When it does, we will remember how to meet it." As the sun rose higher, its light caught the melted surfaces, scattering reflections like 1,000 small fires. The warriors began their retreat to the transports, leaving Calgar alone among the ruins. He removed his helm and breathed the cold air deeply. For the first time since the battle began, the air did not smell of blood. It smelled of iron and frost, the scent of beginnings hidden inside endings. He looked up and saw, faint in the daylight, the glimmer of Circe's scar in the distant sky, a faint star that would never move. He wondered if, centuries from now, men would see it and mistake it for something divine. Mara watched from the ridge as the procession moved back toward the waiting ships. She held a small, scorched piece of ceramite in her hand, the fragment of a shoulder plate bearing the sigil of the first company. She did not know whose it had been, only that it had survived the fire. She set it into the earth beside the ruins and whispered, "You held long enough." The wind carried her words into the crater's heart. That night, the sky over Macragge cleared for the first time in months. Stars returned, unblinking and cold. Calgar stood on the command balcony of the rebuilt citadel, his armor stripped of ornament, his face illuminated by the faint light of the heavens. Cassius joined him again, holding a data slate. "The first of the tyrannic war veterans have assembled," he said. "They ask for your blessing." Calgar considered this for a long moment before answering. "Then give them my silence," he said. "Let them learn that silence too can be a kind of strength." Cassius bowed and departed, his footsteps fading into the new halls. When Calgar was alone, he spoke softly to the night. "We are the wall again," he said, "not because we are unbreakable, but because we are rebuilt." The wind shifted, and for an instant he thought he heard voices in it, the echoes of those who had kept his promise. He closed his eyes, allowing the sound to pass through him like a tide. Far above, the scar of Circe burned faintly, a distant wound refusing to close. Beneath it, Macragge slept beneath its frost and fire, dreaming of the next awakening. The galaxy turned, indifferent but alive, and in the cold halls of the rebuilt fortress, the Ultramarines began their vigil anew. The silence of victory settled over them all, vast, sacred, and utterly human. Night settled over Macragge like a deep inhalation, steady and cold. The new fortress stood where the old one had died, its walls rising from glassed stone, its banners whispering in wind scented with metal and snow. Calgar walked the upper ramparts alone, his breath fogging the air. Below, the lights of rebuilding flickered across the ruins, welding sparks, torch fire, the labor of the living shaping monuments for the lost. Each spark looked, from a distance, like a soul attempting to rejoin the stars. He paused where the mountain met the edge of the polar plain. The ice glowed faintly, catching the reflection of the orbital beacons that circled above. Circe's scar remained visible even now, pulsing faintly in the night, like a warning disguised as beauty. For every triumph, the galaxy left a mark. He thought of the fortress that had stood here before, of Invictus standing before its gates, of men whose names had been carved into silence. He pressed a hand against the cold parapet. "You held long enough," he whispered. The wind answered, carrying snow and memory in equal measure. Inside, the Hall of Remembrance was lit by 100 candles. Cassius stood before the assembled veterans, his voice low, reverent. "We fight not for vengeance," he said, "but for continuity. The swarm will come again, and when it does, it will find us waiting." His words fell like iron nails securing faith to duty. The veterans bowed their heads. Some murmured prayers, others remained still, listening to the sound of the candles hissing in the draught. Outside, the faint hum of the fortress generators replaced the heartbeat of war. Mara Dace stood apart from them, near a shattered window frame that had been rebuilt into a shrine. She wore no armor, only a mechanic's cloak, its edges scorched from battle. In her hand, she held a strip of cloth taken from the old banners, blue turned black by fire. She tied it to the sill and whispered the same words Calgar had once spoken. Not victory, survival. Then she turned away, knowing the wind would finish what her voice could not. Far above, the fleet maintained its vigil. Ships circled in slow orbits, their running lights glimmering like distant embers. Each hull carried scars, each scar a lesson. In the command deck of the Octavius, data feeds pulsed faintly with life, transmitting no orders, only presence. The galaxy slept uneasily, but Macragge endured. Calgar looked up once more toward the faint light of Circe's scar, and found in it neither comfort nor dread, only continuity. The universe did not forgive. It merely observed, yet that was enough. He turned from the parapet and walked into the fortress's quiet heart, where the candles still burned against the dark. The dawn that touched Macragge was pale and almost human. It arrived without ceremony, threading light through the remains of the storm, until the ice fields shone like glass and the wind lost its voice. From the highest tower of the rebuilt fortress, Calgar watched the sun climb, a slow, deliberate motion that felt older than grief. The night's frost clung to his armor, melting in thin rivulets that caught the light and ran like tears he would not shed. Behind him, the banners of Ultramar stirred in the weak wind, whispering not of triumph, but of continuation. The first bells rang at mid-morning, deep and resonant, calling the world to remembrance. The sound carried far across the valley, over the blackened plains where once had stood walls and heroes. Citizens gathered in the avenues below, farmers, artisans, soldiers too young to have seen the swarm, but old enough to carry its shadow. They knelt when the bells reached their crescendo, not to pray for peace, but to promise vigilance. Peace, they knew, was a lie told by time. Calgar descended to the courtyard where the honor guard waited, their armor polished but scarred. Cassius walked beside him, the crozius gleaming in the winter light. "The chapter endures," the chaplain said, his tone equal parts pride and fatigue. "We endure," Calgar answered. "That is not the same." The words hung between them, neither contradiction nor confession. In the great hall, the new reliquary stood at the chamber's heart. Within its glass walls lay fragments from the northern fortress, the cracked helm of Saul Invictus, a melted purity seal, a gauntlet turned to obsidian by fire. Around these relics were etched the names of the fallen, thousands of lines that shimmered when the light passed through them. The hall was silent except for the echo of footsteps and the faint hum of the generators that powered the candles. Light born of machinery, fragile and constant. Mara entered quietly, her mechanic's cloak newly mended, grease still marking her hands. She approached the reliquary and placed something small upon its base, a shard of blue stone, smooth from being held too tightly for too long. "For Fail," she whispered. None answered. None needed to. The stone caught the light and glowed faintly, as though remembering its first sky. Outside, the wind shifted again. The smell of frost gave way to salt as the southern seas thawed, their waters reclaiming ground once burned to glass. Across those waves, the light of Circe's scar flickered faintly, a false star born of sacrifice, steady in its wound. Calgar turned toward it, his reflection caught in the reliquary glass beside the relics of his brothers. "Let them come again," he murmured. "We will teach them how walls are built." And for the first time since the silence began, the fortress of Macragge felt alive once more. The snow returned at the edge of spring, falling in slow, deliberate spirals over the rebuilt walls. It did not bring silence, it only softened it, made the world seem momentarily forgiving. Calgar stood upon the parapet and watched the flakes melt against the warm stone, each one vanishing before it could settle. The fortress below pulsed with quiet labor. Cranes moved in rhythm, servitors dragging plasteel girders into the skeletons of new towers, voices rising in work chants that sounded almost like hymns. Even in the aftermath of ruin, men built. That was the only defiance left to them. He looked to the horizon where Circe's false star still hung, a faint and constant ember in the pale sky. In its cold light, he thought of Starn and Invictus, of every name the archives had been forced to carve into alloy, each etched letter costing a memory. He wondered how long the galaxy would remember before hunger came again. The Imperium had many walls. He had begun to understand that every one of them was temporary. Yet duty demanded that he pretend otherwise. "If walls must fall," he murmured, "then we rebuild from the rubble upward." Below, the Hall of Remembrance opened, its gates for the first pilgrims, citizens of Ultramar, children clutching flowers, veterans walking with measured steps. Mara guided them through the halls, her hands still blackened from labor, her eyes brighter than the candles she carried. She spoke softly, describing the relics, the stories, the places where fire had once sung. When she reached the cracked helm of Invictus, she paused. "He did not die here," she said. "He became part of what holds us still." The pilgrims bowed, understanding without needing more words. At dusk, Cassius entered the chapel, carrying a single tome, its leather bindings scorched, its seal re-waxed. He placed it before Calgar. "The Codex has been amended," he said. "A new chapter records the First Tyrannic War." Calgar touched the cover, but did not open it. "History is not victory," he said quietly. "It is a warning." Cassius inclined his head. "Then let it warn in your name." Outside, night gathered. The aurora swept across the polar sky once more, green and violet ribbons wreathed in frost. Calgar remained on the wall long after the others had gone, his breath misting in the thin air. Somewhere beneath his boots lay the buried stones of the old fortress, and deeper still, the bones of those who had refused to retreat. He imagined their silence as a kind of oath, a promise that endurance, even without triumph, was a language the galaxy would always understand. The wind rose again, carrying whispers of the sea. Calgar turned toward the dawn that would follow and did not flinch. When dawn came again, it carried no warmth, only clarity. The light stretched thinly over the ice fields, turning them to a plain of mirrors where every reflection seemed older than the world. Macragge stood rebuilt, but not renewed. The scars were preserved intentionally, each fracture filled with glass to remind the living of what could not be replaced. Calgar walked through the outer court, where the first recruits of the Tyrannic War veterans assembled in silence. Their armor bore the blue of Ultramar, but was edged in black, the color of remembrance. Cassius addressed them first, his voice a deep echo against the stone. "You are not heirs of victory," he said. "You are witnesses of survival. Let that be your creed." The recruits knelt, not as warriors swearing glory, but as custodians of memory. When they rose, the sound of their armor, moving as one was like the heartbeat of a world, remembering how to live. Mara watched from the steps of the forge, her hands folded. She had taken command of the Artificers' Guild now, leading those who repaired what others broke. The wind tugged her cloak as she looked toward the sky, where Circe's wound still burned like a sentinel. "It's watching," one apprentice whispered. "It never fades." Mara nodded. "Then neither will we." Calgar descended from the parapet and passed through the line of veterans. His shadow stretched long across the courtyard, merging with theirs until none could tell them apart. He carried no weapon now, only a simple banner folded beneath one arm, the last salvaged fragment from the polar fortress. At the center of the yard, he unfurled it, the fabric catching the new wind. It bore no words, no heraldry, just the faded mark of ash, where once the sigil of Ultramar had burned away. "This," he said, "is what endures." The silence that followed felt infinite. Even the wind paused. Around him, the fortress stood like a cathedral carved from sacrifice, its towers reaching toward the scarred sky as if daring it to open again. Calgar raised his gaze to Circe's light and felt the old ache return, not of grief, but of continuity. "If they come," he whispered, "we will answer." The veterans saluted, gauntlets striking armor in slow unison. The sound rolled through the mountains like thunder, dissolving into the vast quiet beyond. And somewhere, in that quiet, The galaxy turned once more, unchanged, unmerciful, and alive. The false star still burned, unblinking. Macragge stood beneath it, unbroken. The sun dipped low over Macragge, casting long shadows across the frozen plains, and the light trembled against the walls of the rebuilt fortress. Calgar stood upon the highest tower, gauntlets resting on the stone railing, eyes tracing the horizon where ice met sky in an unbroken line. The wind carried the scent of frost and salt, of fire turned to memory, and through it came a faint echo of the past. The clatter of weapons, the hiss of spore pods, the voices of men who would not speak again. The battlefield was silent now, but silence had weight, and Calgar felt it settle into his chest. Below, the tyrannic war veterans moved in measured formation, their boots scouring the snow as though testing the ground itself. Their armor bore the marks of survival, scratches, dents, and scorched edges, but also the faint gleam of purpose. They carried no banners today, no symbols of glory. Their mission was not to triumph, but to endure, to remember, and to prepare for the inevitability that hunger would return. Calgar watched them and knew that this was the only victory that mattered: continuity. The Imperium lived, but at a cost that was carved deep into the frozen earth beneath their feet. The Hall of Remembrance stood open, candles flickering against the walls, their light catching shards of melted ceramite and fractured banners. Within, relics of the fallen, helmets, gauntlets, weapons, glowed faintly in the amber light. Mara Dace moved silently among them, placing a small token beside each artifact: a piece of stone, a shard of metal, a strip of fabric. Her hands trembled only slightly, betraying the weight of memory she carried for those who could no longer bear it themselves. Every object, every name, was a promise kept, a debt acknowledged, a story unbroken. Calgar descended the tower steps slowly, each footfall deliberate, carrying the weight of command and loss alike. Cassius followed, Crozius in hand, reciting the litany of endurance in a voice that neither demanded nor comforted. The wind rose, tugging at their cloaks, whispering through the ruins and carrying the ghosts of the fallen across the courtyard. They did not grieve here. Grief was for those who had the luxury of hope. They honored the living by ensuring that the past remained a lesson etched into every stone, every scar. At the edge of the plains, Circe's false star pulsed faintly, a distant wound in the sky that refused to heal. Calgar raised his hand as if to touch it, knowing that even in its absence of mercy, it had shaped their endurance. "We survived," he murmured, voice low, almost lost to the wind, "and that is enough to continue." The words were not triumph, they were truth. The galaxy would not forgive, and the swarm would return. But Macragge remained. The fortress remained. The names of the fallen remained, etched into stone, memory, and silence alike. As the sun disappeared behind the ice horizon, the sky darkened, stars awakening in careful patterns above the planet. Calgar turned from the view, chest heavy, yet unbowed, and walked back into the fortress, knowing that vigilance was eternal and that the cost of immortality was the constant weight of remembrance. He would carry it, and the empire would endure, not in glory, but in survival, in memory, and in the quiet strength of those who remained. The wind swept across the polar ridges, lifting snow and ash, and the night closed over Macragge. Silence settled like a mantle, and for the first time it was not empty. It was complete.